like I said, when I can, I'll go to the museum and draw from the dioramas. If there's an animal that I'm not, and there's often whorls of fur and things that you can't really imagine that you need to see the animal in. You know, anyone who knows, say, horses or something knows they often have a sort of what you'd call like a cowlick right in the middle of their head, and it whirls around, you know, that kind of stuff in different ways. The fur grows on the animal to shed water. And those things, you've got to see them in real life. You can't make that stuff up, and I like to get it right if I can. And then, like, for example, the one that's up on the screen, there's a pencil drawing of the skull, there's a pencil drawing of the watermelon chunk, there's a pencil drawing of the lobster, of the bird, of the corn. Everything was drawn. I went to the farmer's market and bought all that stuff, and I drew it in pencil first, and then I drew it in pencil on the sheet that I was actually going to. So there's sketchbooks with all the details in them, you know, and that's just the traditional way to work. When you're working in watercolor, you don't make it up as you go the way you paint in oil often. You have to figure it out ahead of time and then lay it within, unless you're just doing a wet-on-wet abstraction or something, you must, if you're doing the kind of thing I'm doing, you plan ahead. It's very much like they did frescoes. You plan all your, so by the time the actual painting comes, I'm through with creativity. I'm just executing at that point.
Do you have shows then that have some of these smaller sketches?
No, not yet, no. I don't feel like that's interesting yet. That's for someone else to come along and clean up after me and do. I don't really see how, you know what I mean? I'm like everything, you know, Walton Ford. It's just it's just too much, you know? A lot of people can draw, you know? It's not really that interesting, you know? Unless you put it together. When they're in sketchbooks, it's just a pretty good drawing of a lobster. It's really not, you know.
I have one more question, if that's all right.
Mm-hmm.
When did you first become aware of conservation issues? And are there any personal accounts where you were personally aware of a loss of a particular place or habitat that was close to you?
I grew up in the suburbs. It was there. It was it. You just looked around and you knew what you didn't have, because I was interested in birds. And we had bird feeders, and my dad was a fisherman and a sportsman, and on vacations we'd go to places like Canada. When I was 6 years old, portage into lakes in Canada and go trout fishing for a week and then come out. So I'd been exposed to wilderness as a little boy, following my dad around and going fishing with him. He taught me how to fly fish. So then we go back to the suburbs where all the polluted streams going through golf courses were where I hung out, because it was sort of like empty space, and there might be a pheasant in there and some frogs to catch. But you knew that, like, oh, if I could go back to the 1920, this would have had trout in it. And I lived on Long Island Sound, which has got its own problems. All the water was, when I was little, and then we moved to the Hudson River Valley, and I had the Hudson River, which is, it was better on that side because there was still quite a lot left. But nevertheless, the palpable sense of loss is everywhere. And the part of the country, similar to here, it's a part of the country that's been settled by Europeans for a really long time. So, you know, they've altered the landscape in many, many ways for many, many centuries. And, well, for not quite, you know, but New York City, settled by the Dutch, blah, blah, blah. So, you know, you looked around and you saw the changes. It was easy to figure out that there was a lot here that wasn't, you know. Yeah, I guess, but she has to get a microphone. I guess they choose, I don't know. I gotta let, that's all right. Don't ask me. Just ask me.
Your paintings are so large, and being watercolor, how do you prevent it from the gravity pulling the color down?
It's true, because I do put them up on easels. They're all I'm on foot when I make these pictures, and they're on an easel. So the wet part is only in the beginning when I'm blocking in big areas of color. I'm dipping the brush into the water. I'm getting a lot of pigment on it, and then I'm having to block in big areas with a big brush, and that's when the danger of dripping is pretty great. And I've learned to sort of tour de force techniques, you know, where you're faster than the drip. I don't know. That's what you have to do. And you're applying it, and then you're grabbing it and bringing it back up again, and you're applying it, and when you get down to a bottom edge, you've got to have exactly the right amount of water. But I do it now, I don't even think about it, It's just something that I know how to do at this point. But yeah, it's a challenge. Yeah. I'm always having a nightmare that I'm going to drop a whole bottle of ink right down the middle, like when I'm making the last. It's about to leave the studio. And it's bound to happen, so I have to be psychically ready for it and not like, it's going to happen to me. I already know it.
There's a question in the back here, and then the one in the back there. Well, stay on the row you're in, go straight back there, okay, and then there's one on the other side.
Hi, I'm just curious about other contemporary artists that you might be interested in.
Yeah.
And also, more specifically, if there are any non-representational artists, contemporary, that you might be interested in.
Yeah. Those are good questions. That's an art student or something?
Instructor.
Excellent. Yeah, I figured. There's a few that interest me. I like to think about what Matthew Barney's up to. He's interesting because he came up with this sort of alternative narrative that, but he doesn't work and there's a lot of art history in his stuff as well, and a personal language, and metaphor and all of that. So I was interested to see what he was up to. I'm friends with and interested in this project that Tom Sachs does with these. He is a friend, and we traded a gun, and he got a watercolor. And he's kind of an unlikely person until you start thinking about his project, and it involves text, and it involves metaphor and political kind of outrageousness, But I have a gun that he made me a gun at, and he makes the stocks out of police barricades from New York City that he steals. And then he makes the gun. It's a zip gun. It's a gun that made out of parts from the hardware store. And mine is a rifle with a laser spotter in it. And it has a speech from Kennedy on the stock that he burned in with the burning tool. And so it's an assassination weapon to kill a president with if you want. It's an evil piece of art, man. And you could see why I would like that. I thought this was an amazing thing. And it really fires, which is also really scary, but you don't want to fire it because Tom made it. So he's an interesting artist. I'm going to forget.
Any abstract painters?
Abstract painting. Yeah, it's not a big concern, so I don't end up looking that much at it because it doesn't help me with my project very much. But that are contemporary, it's sort of they're never abstract. Like I like Steve DiBenedetto, or I like Fred Tomaselli,
Sure.
or guys you're going to put in a psychedelia show. That's not really abstract, but it's definitely a practice that's different than mine. But those guys like what I do, and I like what they do, and it's a mutual admiration thing. It's just fine. I don't know, so purely abstract work that is solving formal issues, is not terribly interesting to me. I think that I understand why that work is so important, but it's not an area that I'm exploring on my own. And so, you've got artists in this museum that I love that it's more like conceptual work, like Christian Marclay. I've been watching his work for years. He seemed to disappear a little while, and then he came back, and he's just better than he's ever been.
Absolutely.
And then photographers like there's a lot of stage narrative photography that was based on what's his name now? I'm forgetting. Jeff Wall, Mike Kelly. These guys I love. I love Mike Kelly. That's unbelievable. Not everything he's done, but when he's good, it's so funny and so sick. And, and then I like things that are unfashionable a little bit, like who's the crazy German that did all the big lead books or whatever the hell?
Kiefer.
Yeah. Now, people don't like Kiefer, but like when I see that big drawing that he did of this big hallway, and it's got some sort of heroes from German literature, and it's this terrifying presaging the Nazis and the way you use the culture. There's a great essay by Simon Schama in the beginning of a book called Landscape and Memory about Kiefer's art and what it has to do with landscape and history and confronting the Nazi past and dealing, because they had this whole thing where it's like the forest was supposed to be the German environment. But then Simon Schama kind of points out that there were like Hasidic lumbermen living in the Polish forest before the Second World War, that they were like among the first guys to get rounded up and murdered, and nobody knew about these guys. And so you see pictures of guys in Hasidic outfits with big, huge arms and hatchets and rolling logs and doing all this stuff that's Germanic in a sense. But those are almost the first Jews you got to kill, because they fuck up the myth. Whoops, I'm not supposed to say that. But they mess up the myth, So you've got but you see what I'm saying? Because Jews are supposed to be urban. And they're supposed to be moneylenders. They're not supposed to be loggers that could beat you up, So Simon Schama is wonderful at writing about that, and Kiefer was pretty wonderful at confronting it, I think, in his best work. I don't know who that is.
Texas. Not as, you don't see her work as much today, but in the
Who I
80s,
tend not
yeah.
to like terribly much are
Yeah.
artists that work in similar modes to me. In other words,
There you go. There was a question all
don't
the way
show
there
me
in the
the
back
cool
on the other
bird
side.
artist. I don't want to know.
Let's see. We can, why don't you just pass the mic over, or Chris, you can go over there, that direction. There we go.
So all of your paintings are made to look old,
Yeah.
and I assume they're made to look old so that they would resemble these older naturalist paintings.
Right.
So I question why they're so big.
Yeah,
And
I know.
then I question why do they have to look old?
No, it's a very good question. It's actually one it took me a while to figure out a smarty pants answer for. But I do like to I want my decisions to have a reason. Again, I'm up against that monkey thing I said before. Don't just put the monkey in because it's weird. And my idea was, the first impulse was desire. I saw Maharajas had tigers that they had shot in India, painted life size. They're like big, huge Indian miniatures of the specific tiger that was shot on a given occasion by a given Maharaja. And there's one in the Jaipur Palace, but they're all over India, these paintings. And they're very flat, but there it is. They measured the tiger, and they painted him life size. And it was the first time I saw one of those. I was used to Indian miniatures that were this big. I suddenly saw a tiger that was life size, and I thought, that's Audubon. That's what Audubon used to do. He used to paint everything life size. But the tiger was so magnificent, you could feel the fear of, when the head of a kitty cat is that big. It's scary. So I thought, I really want to make one of those. But I thought, why would I want to make one of those? And then I started thinking that the history that I was trying to illuminate and the forms that I was dealing with, the visual language that I was dealing with, was always constrained by these notebook-sized natural. They were making notes in the margin because it was a notebook, so that they would then give it to a printer and he would make the prints. So I thought, I want to take small bits of history and amplify them. I want to talk about them in a way that they've never been talked about. I want to blow up what I think is interesting, and make it larger. So I was able to make completely illogical objects. In other words, they're not supposed to fit into the tradition. I had a Native American artist friend called Jimmy Durham, and he said, your work is like a natural history image like Audubon with a computer virus, And he goes, and if we're lucky, the computer virus is going to spread to all the real natural history art through all the eras, get into the Catlins and the Audubons too, and mess them up and get them to tell other stories. But so it was this idea of making something freakish. And then when I started to create those freakish images, I realized now I'm making things that formally had never been made before. And if you're suddenly making a 18-foot by 15-foot watercolor of a life-size elephant, you realize you're in territory that nobody's ever been in. And that's a really good feeling as an artist. You're always looking for something that doesn't exist, yet, So.
One last question, two last questions, okay.
Yeah, we don't want to lose people.
Oh,
They're
okay,
gonna
go
start
ahead.
falling
Yes.
asleep.
In the climate of contemporary art scene, and where conceptual art has taken
Oh, good, I'm looking
preeminence
for the
for
guy,
a long
yeah.
time,
Yeah.
how have you been able to manage to carry on with your career as dealing with narrative and
Yeah, yeah.
figuration and all of the commentary involved in your process, and how you've been able to survive when the market has not been responding to that type of work?
It's a really good question. And it is a challenge for the first part of my career. And what happened was, and I'm trying to think of when a sort of turning point came, but some time after I painted that tiger, I think it was Peter Sheldal wrote about the work in the Village Voice, and he was the first critic to take it seriously, and he's a really good writer, I think, like a very smart guy. And I don't always agree with everything, but he realized pretty early on that what I was doing and that what, say, John Curran was doing was definitely theory-based and conceptually based work, in a sense. Like, this work isn't, when Francis Alice sent Peacock to stand in for him at the Venice Biennale once when he was invited. So he didn't go, but the peacock was wandering around the entire time, and that he's a conceptual artist. And when I thought that was great, and I used something like that, and I thought that feels like one of my own pieces in a funny way, even though he did it without painting anything. So I think like a conceptual artist, and this is a project that is attempting to do that kind of thing. Like it's a pretty obvious metaphor when Francis Alice says, well, I don't want to go and be the peacock, just because I was invited to this thing. So here's your peacock. This is what you want a peacock? You got one, but it's not me, And so he's talking about the role of the artist as a pet, as somebody to be displayed, as somebody to be colorful, as somebody to be fashionable, dressed well, whatever it is. He's making fun of that whole tradition of displaying the artist and overturning a tradition that's very hallowed of like Dali and Andy Warhol, the physical artist as spectacle. And when I make a piece, that's the kind of conceptual framework I bring to it, period. And he's respected as a conceptual artist. Just because I paint, my ideas shouldn't get me kicked out of the room, Wow, I can actually paint a peacock. That gets me less respect, So it was kind of cool that Peter Sheldal was able to notice that kind of thing and put me in a context that wasn't. He wrote about me and Fred Tomaselli in the same breath at the same time because we both had shows up, and he pointed out all the similarities in the thinking, and that was good for me because Tom was already accepted by that framework and I wasn't. Does that work as an answer?
And then we had a question up in the, yeah.
It's probably a better question to end with than mine because it was mine's more practical. When you were talking about how you made these large watercolors and that it hasn't really been done that much, I was wondering if there are issues with preservation or if you have to help collectors thinking about how to take care of the paintings. I just saw this Turner show in Washington, D.C., and there were all of these watercolors that I'd never seen, and the watercolors looked really washed out. And we were having this conversation if it was because the paint was different then, or if watercolors are inherently less archival, and just because of the size of the pieces, I wondered if that's something that had come up in your work.
Yeah, that's interesting stuff. The interesting thing about the kind of watercolors I use, and I'm not sure what Turner was doing, and I don't know what his... Anyway, the pigments are the exact same pigments that you would have in an oil painting. It's cadmium, it's umber, it's lampblack, and the materials are heavy metals, earths, and burnt things, to make blacks. So these are permanent as they can be, as far as any kind of pigment is, and they're under UV glass, if they're not in direct sunlight all the time, they should last a while. Just because I'm not doing anything really crazy, you know. If you go and buy a Matthew Barney drawing that's going to be maybe this big and is every bit as expensive as one of my big watercolors, and it's made out of Vaseline on paper with some other, like, ballpoint pen or something, you know, good luck, baby, you know, like handing that off to your kids, you know. I'm not saying that Matthew Barney shouldn't make a painting out of Vaseline, but it's ironic that this issue often comes up with collectors and because they're used to your magazine sitting out in the sun and fading, so they freak out a little because it's on paper. But I'm taking a calculated gamble that at this point the work is expensive enough that the people are going to take good care of it and maybe keep it out of the direct sunlight, and I'm hoping that it'll last. What's good is the show represents the last 10 years of my work, so some of those things are 10 years old, and we borrowed them back from collectors that bought them 10 years ago, and we haven't seen them, and they look good. So I'm thinking, well, we're 10 years down. It's better than the Vaseline picture probably look in 10 years. So I'm feeling pretty good about it. Like I said, the cake's a watercolor made since 1620 in this place in Amsterdam. I'm putting my faith in that. There's a couple of good-looking Dürer watercolors that have been sitting around for 400 years.
And of course, you make them look old, so if they deteriorate a little bit, it'll be perfect.
Isn't that great?
Absolutely. Well,
All right.
I think that's a good place to
That's where we're ending.
to end. So thank you, Walton, and thank all of you for joining us
Thank you for
today.
putting up with all this.
Yes.